Ludovika-University of Public Service in Budapest, Hungary. Sir holds a doctoral degree in public international law in the field of UN peacekeeping and 8 years of experience in higher education, teaching courses in international law, international relations, diplomatic and consular relations, and in international organizations such as UN peacekeeping, amongst others. Sir has also guest lectured in various countries like India, Spain, Sudan, and the Netherlands, and has an extensive list of publications to his credit. Today, we invite Professor Hars to deliver us a lecture on sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. Professor, the platform is yours, and I would request you to take the mic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's my great honor to be here virtually at Ludovika-University at this Saturday. Well, it's morning here in Hungary, but I understand that it is early afternoon in India. So it's my pleasure to be here. And first and foremost, I would encourage you to ask questions. If something is unclear, since this is a highly complex topic, I would encourage you to ask questions, because one of my chief goals here is to make sure that you understand what we are dealing with. And sometimes it can be difficult to wrap our hands around this whole issue of sexual exploitation and abuse. And this is one of the first key things that I would like to touch upon, is that how can it be possible if we have a UN peace operation that is supposed to be protecting the human rights, the well-being, the individual safety of those populations involved? How is it possible for them to be engaged in sexual exploitation and abuse? And right off the bat, let me just say that this is a widespread phenomenon, but not everyone who's involved in UN peace operations is involved. So let me just say that at least around 99% of UN peacekeepers are doing a fantastic job, a very important job that no one else is willing to do, risking their lives for the safety and well-being of the local population. However, there is a small percentage of them, a persistent percentage, by the way, who are engaged in unlawful criminal acts, namely sexual exploitation and abuse against the very population that they are aiming, or that they were supposed to be protecting. And this can be called the black stain on the blue helmet that is casting a tremendous shadow on the effectiveness and reputation of UN peace operations, and it will have a plethora of negative effects on both, of course, the victims, the UNs, and it will result in some very negative consequences for the perpetrators as well. So what is sexual exploitation and abuse, and how large a phenomena this is? Basically, we can differentiate between several instances of sexually motivated crimes and misdemeanors in a peace operation. We can have, for example, a so-called sexual and gender-based violence, which do not require any sort of specific armed conflict to begin with. A bit narrower and a bit more difficult scope is the conflict-related sexual violence category, which exists basically because it is enabled by the conflict itself. So if an armed militant is committing some sort of sexual act against the local population, that will be a conflict-related sexual violence. So how is it different from sexual exploitation and abuse? Well, the specific relationship in sexual exploitation and abuse is prevalent, because in this case, there is someone who is supposed to be protecting those individuals, so someone belonging to a UN peace operations personnel, and the victim is usually the civilian or a member of the civilian population of the host country where the peace operation is deployed. So how is it different than any form of sexual harassment? Well, sexual harassment can also occur side by side in a UN peace operation, but sexual harassment will mean that one member of the operation is harassing the other one for sexual purposes. So there the conduct remains internal inside the operation itself, and it is not targeting the civilian population. How large a problem is this for UN peace operations? Well, we have data from 2007. So that was the first year. Then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has launched the initiative to at least collect the data on sexual exploitation and abuse. And from 2007, we now have data on the occurrence of the phenomenon. And as you can see, the number of cases range between 50 and around 130. And by this, you could say that, well, this is not so many cases. Why is this then such an important thing? Well, firstly, because this is not the overall number of cases. These are just the reported allegations on a yearly basis. And let me explain what this means. This means that these are the number of let's say, allegations, for a lack of a better word, that have reached the knowledge of the UN. However, an allegation by itself is a very peculiar phenomenon. We cannot really translate it to case, because it can have several cases occurring continuously. It can involve several victims, several perpetrators. We do not know. So one allegation can be, let's say, 14 victims who have been sexually exploited and abused by, let's say, 4 or 5 peacekeepers, and that will still show up as one allegation. The other major thing is, of course, underreporting. Several reports by NGOs suggest that underreporting of sexual exploitation and abuse can range between 15 to 30 times as much as it has been reported to the UN. Which means that if there are roughly, let's say, 60 or 70 cases, as we have seen for the last several years, the veritable number of cases can be several hundred or even 1,000. Why is underreporting such a huge issue? Well, think about the circumstances. We have a country usually who is the in whose territory there's a peace operation going on, and that country will host the peacekeeping forces. If there's a peacekeeper, let's say, in the middle of the Congolese rainforest, and he violates that girl, he commits sexual abuse, will that girl be able to file a written complaint online in English saying what has happened? Not exactly the clear possibility. That is one of the reasons that the UN has been experimenting with new forms of reporting to make sure that the underreporting of cases is getting reduced. But it is a general tendency for all of the sexual crimes that exist, and even for domestic violence, for example, that underreporting is still a huge problem. There's victim blaming, there's self-blaming by the victim, there's a lack of belief by the authorities as well. It can have cultural ramifications, whatever. So underreporting by itself is going to be a huge phenomenon. So when you're looking at data that is disclosed by the UN, it is of course very important, but always take it with a grain of salt, and it cannot be neglected to use our own rational brains to understand what lies behind this phenomenon. Now, if you're interested, and I will share a presentation with Professor Srivastava, there is a detailed rundown of what the difference between these expressions are. So I will not, since we only have around 40 to 45 minutes, I will not take your time with detailing these charts. However, let's be on the same page of what sexual exploitation and abuse is. And out of these, sexual abuse, can be regarded as the actual or threatened physical intrusion of a sexual nature. So when someone is forcing the sexual act, or the perpetrator is creating unequal or coercive conditions. For example, locking the door. For example, forcing the other party to accept money. The forced nature is the key here, and that there is either a threat of the physical intrusion or an actual physical intrusion happening to the victims. Sexual exploitation is somewhat different. It is considered to be the somewhat milder form of the two, which can be defined as an actual or attempted abuse of a position of vulnerability, differential power, or trust for sexual purposes. So when someone is handing out, for example, aid supplies, food, medicine, and they are saying that they will like to that they would like the victim or the beneficiary of assistance to provide something in return, then that is sexual exploitation, because their dynamic is going to be quite different. One is one party, the victim basically is forced to rely on the other party for help, and then this the unevenness of the situation will result in the exploitation by itself. So abuse will be the actual or attempted physical intrusion, and exploitation is when the position of power is being abused. It is being used to elicit sexual favors, and this whole together will form SEA or C, or sexual exploitation and abuse, that we'll be discussing today. Now, how can this occur inside a peace operation? Well, firstly, we have some very strict rules on when it can never ever happen, or when it is strictly illegal under all circumstances. For example, having sexual relations with a minor, who is defined by the UN as any person who is under the age of 18. So it is irrespective of whether your country has the age of majority at 16 or 21. For the UN's perspective, having sexual relations with someone who's under 18 will be considered to be a forbidden act. Also, if it is in exchange for any type of assistance, food, goods, services, or money, that is considered to be, of course, also strictly forbidden. So, how can this happen? If you see a peacekeeper camp, for example, somewhere, it will employ locals. How do they select those locals who will be working there in the kitchen, or as cleaning ladies, or as private contractors? For instance, well, they can have the regular looking for contract, and then perhaps we'll come to some form of understanding, or they might say that yes, you will be our provider for food, for cleaning, for translation, for any type of service, and then we'll ask something in return. That is, of course, also strictly categorized as forbidden. Another category that is not outright forbidden, but it is strongly discouraged and almost falling into the same category, is sexual relations with beneficiaries of assistance. Now, you might see some connection between, in exchange for assistance, food, goods, services, or money, and beneficiaries of assistance. Well, these are the individuals who are generally benefiting from the presence of peace operations. So basically, the entire population who is reliant on any form of humanitarian assistance by the peacekeepers themselves. So these types of acts are also strongly discouraged. Then what is allowed? Well, it is allowed to have sexual relations with those who are not reliant on the peace operation, which, bear in mind that since the country in question is usually in a quite bad shape, it is going to be a very narrow scope. So sexual relations, for example, could be possible inside the operation between various members, or between various other international agencies, so between members of a UN peace operation and, let's say, some of the specialized agencies. But still, these personal attachments and these personal relationships can undermine the effectiveness of the mission. And although technically these are allowed, these are not exactly encouraged, not strongly discouraged, but these are not encouraged at all. So informally, what the UN is going to tell all of those individuals who are signing up for a peace operation is that it is best not to have any sort of sexual relations inside the operation, because that is the safest thing to do. But of course, at the center lies several categories which are strictly forbidden, like having sex with minors, having sexual relations in exchange for assistance, foods, goods, services, or money, or through intermediaries, which basically means some sort of prostitution, which is also going to be considered as sexual exploitation. Now, why is this possible? Because we should have a well-structured UN peace operation that should be able to prevent these issues in the first place. So first and foremost, what makes these possible is the state of the country. Let's not forget that we need a peace operation in the country, which means that there is a significant number of problems inside the country, ranging from a weakened police, perhaps there is an ongoing armed conflict still, or the central authority might not be solidified sufficiently for it to provide a deterrent for these acts to happen. There might be a non-functioning justice system, so the country itself is basically unable to do anything about this phenomenon. And this, of course, will be facilitated by the legal system of peace operations as well. The second criteria, or is second element, is that the peacekeepers have some sort of power over the population. Since the central power is getting weakened inside the host state, the peacekeepers are going to be the one who will be having some sort of economic power, because they will be the ones providing some jobs, at least for the locals living near the peacekeepers' compounds or camps. They will have the financial power, because they will be the ones having money to spend. And of course, since they will be the ones helping with the political reconstruction of the country regarding administration, security personnel, and so on, they will have lots and lots of political tools there. So they might be regarded as the privileged individuals inside the country who will have more tools, more avenues available for them, and this will result in a heightened, elevated position inside the country. Let's imagine that you go to a foreign country, you have money with you, you have your supplies that you have brought from home, and you have the guns. But there is no central authority, there is no police, and you are provided by a very strong, you are protected by a very strong legal regime. So basically, what others will tell you, and this is about the lack of accountability mechanisms, that basically you can do whatever you want and there will be no repercussions. Of course, this is not true, or at least this should not be true, but this is the time when the darker side of the human psyche is awakened. And if you have the possibility without the fear of any repercussions, then we do not know what we are capable of. It is my personal belief that no peacekeeper will go to a peace operation with the intent of committing sexual exploitation and abuse. These are crimes of opportunity. They will see a chance and they will take it. So these are not usually premeditated, or at least the first occasions are usually not premeditated. They're not preparing to commit these when they are at home before deployment. They will see a situation where they can exploit it to their own goals, to their own reasons, and they will take this opportunity. Another one that is tied to the lack of accountability mechanisms is that for a very long time, the force commanders, the leaders of all military personnel inside a UN peace operation regarded these acts as sort of a necessary evil. They said that, well, this is war is terrible, and of course, since the dawn of mankind, rape and sexual violence has been a negative side effect, but a continuous side effect of war. And that since wars are usually fought by men, our boys will remain boys. We cannot deny them the urges when they are facing death. Of course, in the 21st century, this is not an attitude that can be maintained. We have the Geneva Conventions, we have strict norms on regulating conduct during war. So this type of activity and this sort of leniency of commanders could be and should be eliminated. Another key aspect that enables these acts is the prevalence of cultural habits. There might be a perception of normalcy because the population itself might have been the victims of sexual crimes by different militia groups or government forces or terrorist organizations for years or for even decades. They might view it as, well, they have done it, now the UN does it. What's the difference? So they will get accustomed to these crimes being committed for a longer period of time. And from a personal point of view, it might also be problematic that sometimes the relatives of the victims will not believe what has happened. The UN might have a very positive reputation when it arrives. It is the organization that arrives to bring some help. And maybe the relatives of the victim will not believe that the UN or the agents of the UN are capable of such things. So the victim might be traumatized from a psychological standpoint that these sort of acts happen. And since there's this belief, it will lead to a lack of reporting, and a lack of reporting will, of course, make newer acts possible as well. Since the power dynamics are also working towards the peacekeepers' favor, there might be a fear of repercussion by the UN personnel from the part of local population. So they might fear that, well, if we are reporting that the perpetrator has been doing this, then they might return, and because they have the guns, that cannot end well. They fear that if we are reporting that the UN is doing these sort of things, then the UN might leave, because if they have been charged with these things, they might not be interested to be involved in resolving this issue. Or let's not forget, and this also ties to cultural habits, that the stigma of being the victim of a sexual crime might also result in the own family of the victim, or the small community that they live in, shunning the individual. They might become outcasts. They might be viewed as someone whose reputation has been sullied, someone who has been deflowered, someone who has fallen, and they are bringing shame to the family or a small community, and they might be cast out to fend for themselves. This is, of course, very negative, because they will result, of course, in underreporting, and underreporting, of course, will enable further acts to be carried out. So what are going to be the effects on either the victims or the perpetrator or the UN? For the victims, of course, they are suffering a huge psychological and physical trauma as a result of the intrusion, or as a result of them being exploited in a serious way. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases, like, for example, HPV/AIDS, or a lot of other diseases, could spread very rapidly in these environments. And let's not forget that one of the most common outcomes of sexual intercourse is, of course, having babies. So when children arrive out of a sexual relation, that will be very problematic, because in a lot of cases, the father or the alleged father will return after, let's say, half a year or a year of service, and then the mother will be left to fend for the baby. This is especially problematic if the mother is getting disowned by the family or by the small community, because if they are cast out and she will have to fend for the baby in a very hostile environment, where she has been cast out from the small protective bubble of her community, then that can be tantamount to a death sentence for both her and for the baby as well. What will happen to the perpetrator? What will his mindset be? Well, there might be a sense of impunity. So if the perpetrator is doing several of these things, and he will return home and say that, well, this was a fun trip. I did what I wanted. There are no negative side effects. The host state, of course, can do nothing, because it is in disarray. I did what I wanted. So when he transmits what has transpired during the operation, he will signal to the others, well, you can do whatever you want. For the perpetrator, him or maybe herself, it is also possible that they will return to another peace operation and commit these acts in a different environment, or return a few years later and commit these acts once again. So this will result in them setting a very negative, recurring bad example, or creating an informal practice that is contrary to what the UN is trying to achieve. So, and of course, this is also quite an informal dynamic. The UN can train peacekeepers, and the sending state can, of course, train peacekeepers on the ethics, on the code of conduct that should be applied. But if there is an older, more experienced soldier or military person saying that, okay, this is what they say in theory, this is what will happen in practice, then who will they listen to? Well, those with experience, those who have experienced what is it like to be in a peace operation. And if the others got away with these conducts, then of course they can do it themselves. And what does it mean for the UN? Well, if the UN is viewed by the local population as an organization that enables or does nothing against perpetrators, that will erode the trust in the UN. If there is no trust by the local population, then that will hinder the mission's goals, because the UN is built on cooperating with the local population, with the local government, with the central government inside the country. If there's no trust, then of course they cannot cooperate, and the mission's goals will be further and further away. So it's a direct threat, a direct challenge to the success of the operation itself. And for the UN in the long term, it can create a negative situation regarding its reputation. Why is reputation so important? Because an international organization lives or dies on its reputation. This will mean that if the UN has a bad reputation, then states will not provide funding, NGOs, wealthy individuals will not provide any help for the UN. So the actual number of peace operations will get reduced, which will further contribute to a lack of security worldwide. So it is in the essential interest of the UN to maintain its good reputation in order for it to be a credible entity in the international theater, and also for making sure that that they actually can fulfill their main objectives, which is, of course, the maintenance of international peace and security. Now, who can be the victims? Because I usually refer to the perpetrators as a he. And that's because in a lot of cases, the vast majority of the perpetrators are male. There have been rare sightings or rare testimonies of even females, women committing these sort of acts. Like, for example, there were reports from 2010, 2011 in Haiti, where there were several female perpetrators, but the vast majority of them are going to be male. And it is an interesting find that we have two circumstances. One is that basically, since this is a crime of opportunity, it will to a large degree depend on the mindset of the perpetrator. So it is irrespective whether they come from a European country or a Latin American country or an Asian country or an African country. They will have, if they have the opportunity, then it will be dependent based on their mindset most of the time. However, what has also been found is that countries with a weaker track record on human rights, and where at home women are not regarded as equal partners, so where the, for example, 1979 as the CEDAW treaty has not been implemented to its fullest, and where the domestic understanding of women are do not reach the level of equality, for example, then this might be more systematic there. So even though everyone can commit these acts, and of course we have seen basically peacekeepers from nearly all countries committing these acts, we will see that those countries with a worse track record in human rights will be more prone to either have individuals committing these acts, or they might be more reluctant to prosecute those who will be committing these. Regarding victims, we can say that usually the younger generation is more likely to become victims, more likely younger girls. What does this mean? Is that ages between, let's say, 12 and 16 are the usual categories for victims, but we have numerous testimonies where not just girls belonging to this age group, but girls belonging to a younger age group, and even young boys have been fallen victims, even as young as the age of 8 or 9. So there have been very disturbing tendencies regarding the young age of victims as well. I briefly mentioned the legal framework, and I will just highlight one aspect of it. As you can see, it is not very difficult to understand, but it is not simple either. So somewhere in the middle. The most important thing to note here is that we have several norms that have been adopted by the United Nations, specifically prohibiting this sort of conduct. However, what you can see from this is that we have several agreements, mainly the so-called Memorandum of Understanding between the UN and the troop contributing countries, and the so-called SOFA agreements or status of forces agreements between the UN and the host state, which both of them will say that the visiting forces, so those members of the military forces and even the civilian component of the sending state that operate under the flag, under the auspices of the UN, will be exempt from the jurisdiction of the host state, which will mean that it is always going to be the sending state, the so-called TCC or troop contributing country, that will be responsible for criminal procedure. So they will have the capabilities to prosecute their own personnel. Neither the UN can do it, neither the host state. And as you can see, there is no connection between the host state and the troop contributing country. So everything will have to go through the UN, which will also mean that the UN will have a sort of elevated responsibility in this regard, because if the UN or inside the UN, if information gets lost or diverted in the vast bureaucracy of the UN, it will mean that that the information does not even arrive at the level of the TCCs, or the troop contributing countries might not be able to, might not be willing to communicate with the UN on what their steps are. So one of the key cornerstones here is that the countries sending the peacekeepers will maintain the exclusive criminal jurisdiction in all cases. They are not willing to share it. They're not willing to hand it over or to make any concessions in this regard. This is basically set in stone. So there are no avenues for it to change. What are some other issues that we can see? Well, basically, if we move from the underreported acts of sexual exploitation and abuse to a more or less adequate justice provided to victims, there are lots and lots of ways where things can be derailed. As I mentioned, the underreporting is, of course, by itself a huge issue, and the allegations themselves can incorporate multiple cases, multiple victims, and multiple perpetrators. So even if the allegation is made, which is quite likely not to be made, but if it is, then the investigation itself can take a very long time. The UN has tried to remedy this by saying that they are initiating a sort of fast tracking of cases, meaning that the state involved will have to respond within 10 working days of the reporting being done. However, if it is done or the 10 days elapsed without any success or any investigation being carried out, this will mean that the UN can conduct its own investigations. However, if these actions are not taken by the troop contributing country and the UN is doing the investigation by itself, or maybe through the host state, this will mean that the judicial forums might say that, well, since, for example, we are in France and the evidence has been collected by the UN, it was not ensured that the collection of evidence was following the due process as it is required by our domestic criminal processes, and then the evidence cannot be relied upon because we do not know how it was conceived, how it was collected. So they are disregarding the case, saying that this does not fit our standards, basically. It is also falling to the discretional decision of the justice system, whether they would like to have something to do with those proceedings. Some countries might say that, yes, in our domestic legal system, it is outright disallowed to collect, for example, evidence abroad. We do not have extraterritorial jurisdiction in our cases. So the justice system may basically put these complaints in the bin on a whim. And even if there is some sort of judicial process, it might not be sufficient. We have had several cases where the outcome of the trials, even if the accused was found guilty, has been inadequate. Meaning that, for example, for sexual exploitation and abuse, they might have had to pay a fine. without any prison sentence, without any loss of freedom for that individual. Of course, that will depend on the country in question, but there is no unified criminal code regarding sexual exploitation and abuse. Even when the UN has been trying to advocate this approach, states have been vehemently denying it. Some states have voluntarily incorporated sexual exploitation and abuse in their own domestic criminal codes, but that is the minority of states. So as we see, there are lots and lots of avenues, lots of ways where the process itself can be derailed. And of course, even if there is a decision in the justice system, that is usually not made available. So they will say that since this involves our individuals, our citizens, we are not disclosing this information. So if you want to research those documents, you have to be either the citizen of the state, or you have to visit the library, the archives of the court in person, because the outcome will not be made available to the public, which is of course hindering research and hindering any sort of feedback given to the victims. I will not go through all of these. This is just to highlight that even with the regular problems, we are having lots and lots of issues. For example, the allocation of responsibility. It is very hard to decide whether for that conduct, besides the individual, who is of course should be held accountable if such a thing happens, is it the responsibility of the UN to do something, or is it the responsibility of the state? Since the states retain exclusive criminal jurisdiction, then ultimately it is the responsibility of the states. However, as we have established earlier, the responsibility of the UN is on the line here. So the UN is feeling some sort of urge to do something in the case. So deciding purely based on legal reasons who should be responsible for it, of course, is not an easy thing to do. What about reporting mechanisms? Of course, we cannot expect the young victims to file the complaints themselves. They might not be able to read or write. They might not have access to the internet, or simply, if the reporting mechanisms are placed in the camp of the peacekeepers, the victims are not exactly encouraged to return to the place where the act has happened. So no victim would want to relive what has happened and to return to the compatriots or the brothers in arms of those who have committed those acts to file a complaint. So the UN has been experimenting with new forms of reporting regarding these acts. There have been several issues regarding whistleblowers and on how to protect them. Because when several diligent individuals have found out that these cases have been derailed inside the UN bureaucracy for some reason, they have leaked information to the media, which has resulted in some criminal processes being instigated. So the effect was positive, but since there was a leak, there was an internal disciplinary measure. Some of these individuals have been fired from the UN, resulting in, of course, a further discouragement to report and to handle these issues. Regarding the punishment of the perpetrators, there is no unified way of ensuring that first it happens, and if it happens, then it is happening to an adequate degree in all of the countries who are involved. And even if it does, the feedback of what has happened to the perpetrators will not reach the victims. They will not be able to go to the country in which the trials are held, even if there is a trial, and they will not be notified by the courts on the results of the cases. Maternity claims are still not exactly enforced. To put it simply, usually the mothers will not know even the full name of the peacekeeper. They might recognize the uniform, they might know a first name, but they will not know the rank, they will not know the surname, they will not know the complete background of the peacekeeper. We even, if the relationship is somewhat consensual, so maybe exploitative because it's done through the beneficiaries of assistance, they will not be able to identify who the father was. And of course, in most of the legal systems, simply accusing someone of being the father without proof will not result in, for example, a DNA test. if several women were to come forward and saying that the father of my child is, let's say, a very important person or a movie star, they will not conduct the DNA test. They will only do it if there is some sort of a tangible proof that they had some sort of relationship prior. So the DNA tests are, of course, remaining a huge issue. And if there is some sort of a DNA test, then of course some sort of child support or some alimony would be necessary for the mothers and for the babies to be received. But since we do not even know how many peacekeeper babies there are resulting from these relationships, it is very hard to put some fine print on it and to give exact numbers. It is also a significant issue that the same perpetrators might be arriving to different missions. So if a country is involved in several peace operations, they might just be rotating or cycling the same individuals, which can result in the perpetrators committing the same acts in various different operations. And the last one is a key thing where why the UN has not been able to speak out against states who are not prosecuting the individuals, is because the UN is reliant on the help and support of these states. So if there are large states or states providing a large amount of contribution to the UN regarding either financially or especially regarding manpower, then saying that this state has not cooperated with the UN and its citizens and its military personnel, for example, have been accused of serious human rights violations, including sexual crimes, then the state might say, okay, then we no longer want to help the UN. And if those states are proving to be reluctant in providing any help for the UN, then the whole peace operations scheme might not move forward. So the UN must work on a very fine edge on cooperating with the countries and also mildly pressuring them towards having these processes domestically done. So these are some of the issues, and I see that our time is getting to run low, and I would like to ask Professor Srivastava, how much time do I still have?
So you can speak for another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Okay, I will just point out a few good things, because I understand that this topic can be very distressing, disturbing, or even resulting in some sort of some form of depression, which is understandable because this is indeed a very dark issue. But let me just highlight a few good things as a closing remark, because there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not a train. So the UN has been working very hard to incorporate the gender perspective into its peace operations, from the peace processes itself into the training and vetting and the establishing of focal points. This has been a very long journey for the UN. It is advocating, for example, in elevating the number of female police and military personnel. But of course, since the countries themselves are having very low numbers of women in their armed forces, this is an uphill struggle. The UN is, of course, setting goals that for 2020, for 2030, 2050, we should have an ever larger number of women present. Right now, for military personnel, it's somewhere between 4 and 6% of the overall number. For police, it is roughly around 14%, and for civilians, it is around 30%. So we have the most issues regarding military. Why is it good to incorporate gender perspectives and to have more females? Well, because as we have found out, females are less likely to commit sexual exploitation and abuse. They are much more empathetic towards the victims. And as several empirical studies show, for example, regarding the practice of the fully female formed police units or FFFPUs that are initiated by Brazil, Nigeria, and first and foremost India, because this was the country that has launched this project in the first place, in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. this has a tremendously positive effect on the number of cases and on the security and the safety perspective of the local population. So when there were female peacekeepers deployed on the streets, the perpetrators were more discouraged, and overall around 35% less cases have emerged as a result because of the dissuasion. However, reporting has also increased substantially, because let's imagine the scenario when a case of sexual exploitation and abuse, or any form of domestic violence for that matter, happens. If the victim is a female and the police officer is a male, then due to cultural differences, the female victims are much less likely to report and to show what has happened and to describe and detail what has happened, even though they speak the same language, belong to the same cultural or let's say tribal group. Whereas if the police officer is a female and the victim is also a female, even though they have different cultures, speak different languages, purely because they belong to the same gender, they are more likely to open up and to detail what has happened and to provide let's say a good testimony on who the alleged perpetrator was. Paternity tests, some countries have found very intriguing ways on how to solve the issue of paternity tests. Basically, several countries like Argentina, Sri Lanka, and Uruguay have said that they require DNA samples from all peacekeepers before deployment. So when a sexual exploitation and abuse allegation surfaces, they already have the DNA database, and then they will have to just combine the evidence. So basically, it's like a fingerprint. You have to provide it beforehand, and then they can check the database if an allegation resurfaces, without the need for the victims to prove that they actually had a relationship with that individual, which is basically impossible in a lot of the cases. The UN now has a trust fund also for victims that is supposed to pay for remedying the medical situation, providing legal help, providing psychological assistance, and also for providing so-called business starter kits for those individuals. So they have their own living to make, and they are not forced to resort to, for example, prostitution or to provide sexual favors for support by the peacekeepers. The UN is also putting in place a whistleblower protection system. In the bottom left part of the picture, you can see Mr. Andras of Sweden, who was the most notorious whistleblower in the UN, who has leaked the major cases of sexual exploitation and abuse in the Central African Republic in 2014. And even after 20 years of distinguished service at the UN, he was fired. He was sacked for his conduct. Making sure that such a thing cannot happen again, the UN has put in place some whistleblower protection system, but the exact contents of this system are still somewhat unclear. And of course, there are several states who have instituted these so-called rapid investigation and accountability mechanisms, meaning that they would like to cope with the UN standards of a rapid investigation, on-site investigation that is being carried out by the personnel. And for instance, Bangladesh and Egypt have been very instrumental and leading the way forward in making sure that these accountability mechanisms are put in place. I can go on and on about these issues, but I think it's more prudent to stop now because the 5 minutes has also elapsed. So if you have questions on any of these side issues and side projects, I will be very happy to answer them. And with that, I would like to yield the floor back to Professor Srivastava.
Thank you, Professor Hars. This session has been very insightful because it's not just focusing on the international law, but also dabbles into the larger debate of gender, and something that came to my mind hearing you was also privacy. And these are things that we would like to interact more on with you. So one of the first things that I would want to ask while the participants send in their questions. Now, you highlighted that irrespective of the country, the personnel are engaging in acts of sexual exploitation and abuse. Is it because of the idea of masculinity that is ingrained in and that varies with systems, that this exploitation is common across, irrespective of the country from which the personnel belongs? And just to follow up on that, uh, in that system of in that group of people where women are also serving with these men, does that masculinity also impact these women, and does it lead them to, indulge in acts of sexual exploitation and abuse just to prove that we can also be part of the tribe?
That's an excellent question, and I think you are touching upon one of the key aspects here, is that we have had sexual exploitation and abuse committed by countries with almost immaculate human rights records. So states that are very high on the UN Human Rights Council's list of human rights abiding states, like for example France and Uruguay. And we have had perpetrators from countries with a tentatively worse record, like for example Bangladesh and Egypt. They are listed here as positive examples because they have put in place accountability mechanisms. But it was needed for these accountability mechanisms to be put in place because there were several perpetrators arriving from these countries. So that's always two sides of the same coin. But yes, as several authors in academia have pointed out, there is the sort of gender aspect to this whole issue, where the masculinity of the armed forces is having a negative consequence here. And that is why the UN is trying to elevate the number of female peacekeepers. However, what we do not know is where the threshold is. So until a certain percentage of the armed forces being women, we can see that women are behaving in a similar manner as we have formulated it, to belong to the same tribe. So they will, I wouldn't say that they would participate in these acts, but they are more likely to turn a blind eye. So let's say if we have, following these percentages, 4 women in the contingent out of 100, then they will be, of course, a minority. So they will not be able to say that, yes, we do not accept it, you have to report it, because if they want to fit in, then they will have to be more adaptable to the standards. And if those standards are, of course, very negative and resulting in sexual crimes, then they're more likely to turn a blind eye. We do not know how many or what the percentage should be for these numbers to change. I would estimate that if, of course, half of them would be male and half of them female, then this would not be such an issue, because they are the norms themselves, the modes of conduct will change. Between 4% and 50%, that is, of course, a very large scale, and we don't know what is necessary. And for this reason, I do share the UN's mindset that the more women we employ in a peace operation, the higher our chances will be of the events not taking place, and if the events are taking place, then for the reporting to happen.
Thank you so much, Professor Hars. Another question, and this again comes from a reading on gender. Do you think that while we do understand that both men and women, boys and girls, can complain should such a situation arise, they can be victims, but calling it sexual exploitation and abuse instead of gender-based abuse, does it have any sort of restrictive impact on dealing with the problem that exists?
To provide a short answer, I don't think so. To provide a much longer answer, I think it is also either implied or included, but these expressions, like for example, domestic violence, are a bit more inclusive, because they will mean that we are prepared for the eventuality of it happening both ways. So even if there are cases, for example, of domestic violence, the vast number of cases will be where men are the perpetrators and where the victims are females, but not necessarily so. We have had several cases where it was the other way around, highly atypical, but having the more neutral terms of gender violence or sexual exploitation and abuse will enable us not to turn a blind eye towards the segment of the population who is not following the usual patterns or the usual trends there. So I think the terminology here is quite important. And especially because for the UN, it took almost a decade to solidify this expression. They have realized the two definitions that we are dealing with when they were finalized. That was around 2015, 2016. So one of the reasons why we have such a large discrepancy in the number of cases throughout the years is not just due to reporting mechanisms, but because, for example, prostitution was sometimes included, sometimes excluded from the definition. So I think now when the UN is settling on the definition of sexual exploitation and abuse, it is a definition that is quite adaptable. But I'm not sure if it can be seen. Let me just slide it back. But they usually have the expression that it includes a number of acts, but it is not an exhaustive list. So there might be other forms, there might be other ways where this happens, but if it falls under the general category of, for example, an attempted abuse of power, then it will fall under these forms. So I think it is wise from the UN's part not to highlight the gender aspect and focus more on the opportunity perspective that these crimes entail.
Actually, why I asked you this is because in India, the law is gendered. So if we talk about rape, then it is the man who commits rape and the woman who gets raped. Now, like you said, it is the true contributing country which will have to apply its laws. Now, in that situation, then it becomes quite, there's a conflict that exists because of the, the situation, the problem that has happened and the law that does exist. So that was the reason why I asked you this question. Okay, so one more thing, and this comes from the answer you gave to the first question. You said that the female troops should be increased, participation of women should be increased. Don't you think that would also lead to further working on safety of these women when they go out there and are part of the workforce of the peacekeeping force? The more women we employ, we also need to ensure that where we are sending them, that is a safe space. So how do you think that can be dealt with?
It's a fair question. I do not think that a peace operation is fundamentally a safe space. Because there's most likely some sort of armed conflict happening there. And if we accept that the participation and the contribution of women are of an equal basis, they can basically do the same job just as good as any man, then that will mean that they will also have to stand up in their own difficult environments and do the same thing that their male counterparts are doing. And I have seen several interviews with female officers who are deployed to very dangerous peace operations, like for example, South Sudan or Mali or the Central African Republic. And they say that there is a palpable distrust at the beginning regarding female peacekeepers, because especially these are most likely traditional societies where the role of women are somewhat different than in other parts of the world. But then they will have to convince them through their conduct that they are just as able and just as capable of doing these things. And this is one of the reasons why the, for example, Indian example of the fully female formed police units are so important, because they're not just there to facilitate reporting, they are serving also as role models for the women who are working there, saying that you do not only have the option to be a housewife. If you choose, you can be someone else. You can work for the security forces. They are also having trainings, for example, on explaining how, for example, sexually transmitted diseases work, how contraception works, how women can defend themselves. For example, it were exactly the Indian peacekeeping police units who have been teaching, for example, self-defense classes to local women in order to better defend themselves. So these are very encouraging examples that are only made possible through the female contribution.
Right, that's very heartening to get to know as well, that this also is happening. Something other than gender, and another intersection that I sort of observed. You said that countries have started collecting DNA databases of the peacekeepers, and eventually that becomes easier for them to trace the paternity. Does it have any, has it found any space in the larger debate of privacy? And has that come up? Or do you think it will come up in future to be discussed?
Regarding privacy, not really, because the UN is also requiring those individuals who are participating in a peace operation, either as military or as civilian personnel, to sign a pledge, for example, that I will not commit these types of acts. I will adhere to the highest standards of conduct. And of course, there's still lots and lots of things to do before a peace operation. If they are going to those parts of the world where there are diseases, for example, and this is also somewhat of a privacy issue, they will have to be vaccinated beforehand, especially during the COVID period. And of course, that is a totally different discussion, how the COVID has changed the landscape, or how the pandemic has affected it, because there was a palpable fear from the local population that we're having peacekeepers from dozens of countries arriving. There's quite likely that they are bringing this epidemic to our homes. So that also created some sort of tension between the local population and these persons. So providing a DNA database, the authorities are saying that you are going there to protect the individuals. You are not going there to commit crimes. So why shouldn't you provide these samples? I haven't heard of any issues regarding privacy, or either on the UN level or on the level of the states involved. So I do not know if that is a problem. Peacekeepers are usually wanting to go to these operations. Not only because it is their moral duty, so to say, because they would like to prove themselves, but also because for a lot of these countries who are the largest contributors, this is a financially valid enterprise, both for the country and for the peacekeepers themselves. Having this exchange of giving something like a DNA sample, I think it's a relatively safe issue, especially because these DNA samples will be kept by the country itself. So there's no UN combined database. It is always the country itself. And since they are the military personnel of these countries, they can be ordered to give their samples without any privacy concerns.
Right, Professor. So, and just to end on a bright note, I want to ask you to tell us some mechanisms that have been adopted to improve the reporting of sexual exploitation and abuse crimes in the UN.
I sometimes get so enthusiastic that I start to talk without unmuting myself, which is a recurring issue in the digital age. Yes. There are several good ways on how the UN has started improving it. And this is something that I wanted to highlight, that there is a cyclical phenomenon in this whole thing. There's usually a major scandal, like we had in 2003 in the Congo, in 2014 in the Central African Republic, after which there is a major report by a renowned individual like Prince Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein of Jordan, or Justice Marie Deschamps of Canada, and they will have some significant findings. And then some elements of those findings will get incorporated into the UN's next wave of reforms. And then, of course, the execution is going to be somewhat lacking, which will enable a new scandal to arrive in a few years. But our current cycle of reform has involved, for example, the best practices being shared. We have the voluntary DNA database. We have the trust fund for victims. There's now a special advisor on the who is advocating the rights of the victims, and there's a special advisor to the Secretary General on sexual exploitation and abuse. And the current UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has had a robust plan in 2017 when he was elected Secretary General, to have a circle of leadership bringing the knowledge of these renowned individuals, former presidents, former prime ministers, former heads of state and heads of government to the table, and to have a voluntary compact with states that is reinforcing their commitment to investigate and to prosecute. However, I am somewhat critical of some of these initiatives because, for example, the Circle of Leadership, comprised of 100 very renowned heads of state, has met twice in almost 5 years now. And they sat down, they said that this is a huge issue. They issued a declaration that, yes, this is a huge issue, and they did nothing else. So these are very good initiatives, but the way they are carried out is in a lot of times quite lacking. But Secretary General Guterres has been re-elected from 2022, and his new report on how, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted peace operations and how these reforms are stating should be out in about a few weeks. So in a few weeks, we'll be more knowledgeable on these issues, but some of these reform initiatives are sounding good on paper, but in practice, they are not implemented to the fullest of their possibilities.
Thank you, Professor Hars. And this has been a very insightful session. And I'm sure for many of us, it's been an introduction to the problem, to the issue that exists. And I'm sure it would have ignited many of our students to research more on it. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for this brilliant presentation today and the one before as well. There have been several takeaways, and I hope that we continue this professional relationship and we will get to see more of each other in the coming times. And hopefully you'll be here soon once this pandemic ends. We would love for you to come to India and visit us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for organizing the event, and of course it was my great pleasure and honor to be here and to talk about these issues. If I could just have one takeaway, despite all of these, and despite being this my PhD research topic as well, I am a great enthusiast of the UN system, because I do believe that there are several situations in the world where it is only the UN who is basically willing to do anything, who is willing to help the local populations. And without the UN, this would not exist. So the answer is not to abolish the UN, not to blame the UN for everything, but to work on actually taking the hard path and then working out compromises on how to improve the system to eliminate this persistent phenomenon, so the UN can do the thing that it does best, which is stabilizing countries and then bringing them back to normalcy. But I can talk a lot about these issues, and I'm very enthusiastic about these issues, but I think I will just leave it at there. Thank you very much for being here. It was very nice, and let's hope to see one another in person once again, either in Budapest or in Ahmedabad.
Certainly. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
दो कार्टून शरबत की दुकान
2 कार्टून
के लिए
स्टार्ट
स्टार्ट